the participants.
Good evening. How does that sound?
It's a little quiet.
So is that worse?
That's great. That's amazing.
Okay.
Should we start the webinar, Emily?
I think we should.
Okay, I'm starting it now.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of our PAiD Professional Development Workshop Series for Artists. We are so excited to be back with you again tonight after a really wonderful presentation last night with the artist Charles Dixon. I am so excited to come into this conversation from the lens of that, and I hope some of you maybe were able to join last night as well. As we have typically been doing, we're going to give a couple of minutes for people to come in, get into the link, get settled, and we'll kick it off in a minute or two. So just please bear with us while we give folks time to get into the session. Good evening again. Just welcoming everyone to tonight's workshop. This is part of the PAiD Free Professional Development Workshop Series for Artists. We are excited to welcome you this evening to our next installment of this workshop series. We're going to give it a couple more minutes just to let folks get themselves into the Zoom before we kick it off in about 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, good evening. Again, welcome for the last time for the last time tonight that I'll be saying welcome to the Free Professional Development Workshop Series for the PAiD Public Artists in Development program. We're so excited to have folks back tonight. I hope to see some returning faces, maybe some new faces joining us from last night's session and the ones we've been having so far. Tonight, as always, want to remind that the session is being recorded and that these recorded sessions will be hosted on the LA County's PAiD website. We will be sharing out the links to that once those are available. Allie, my colleague, Allie M, is going to do an introduction into the PAiD program in just a moment and preview some of the next upcoming workshops. And then we are so excited to be joined tonight by April Banks, Ross Hansen, and Eric Riley to talk about communicating designs for public art commissions. This is an amazing presentation tonight. You guys are in for a great treat. And then as always, we will have time for Q&A at the end of the session. So just to remind, at the bottom of your screen or your Zoom screen, you will see the Q&A button. That Q&A button is where you can enter in your questions. We'll be accepting all questions through the Q&A. You're welcome to enter them at any point during the presentation as things pop up, as you're listening and as you're thinking. And then when we get to the Q&A time, we will go through as many of these questions as we can. So we are excited to start tonight, and I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Allie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Allie, and I'm a project manager at Dyson and Womack. I'll be introducing the PAiD program. So PAiD is a program of the LA County Department of Arts and Culture, and with funding by the Mellon Foundation. And it's a multi-year initiative that aims to advance the career growth and economic empowerment of underrepresented artists in LA County. One of the main goals of the program is to address the historical barriers that artists face when trying to enter public art, and also deal with the wider challenges that artists face throughout their careers. The program is made of multiple components shown here, one of them being the professional development workshops. So this series of free workshops is designed to provide valuable skills and resources to artists of all backgrounds and of all career stages who are just interested in public art. And there are several workshops through October 2nd. And if you want to look at all of the workshops, we'll drop a link to the county's website where you can take a look at all the descriptions and speakers. Another component is the Artist Council. The first open call was launched last year, and we'll be launching the next open call this fall. The council is a group of 8 selected artists commissioned to engage in a series of policy discussions and make recommendations to the county and create temporary public artworks. The PAiD apprenticeship is another opportunity for artists that's opening in the fall. This opportunity is open to artists who have never completed a civic art or public art commission, and the selected artists are going to engage in training and mentorship to complete their first ever public art piece. And then finally, the PAiD website. This is another resource for artists. This website will include all recordings of the professional development workshops and other resources relative to the public art field. The launch of the website is to be determined, but we will notify all attendees when it becomes available. And as mentioned, we have a lot more workshops coming up. The next is on Thursday, August 21st. And for this one, public art opportunities in LA County will have commissioning agencies across all of LA County joining us to directly share with you upcoming artist opportunities and offer resources on how to find them and apply to them. The next one is on August 29th. We are going to explore best practices for engaging diverse stakeholders, fostering dialogue, and talking about how we can input community input into a public art process. There's several more you can look at on the website. And again, I'll drop this link that you see in blue in the chat.
Thank you so much, Allie. Really appreciate it. So tonight's workshop, the title is Communicating Designs for Public Art. And we have an incredible panel here with us. We have 2 folks from the KDI, Kunkui Design Initiative, who are going to share a little bit about their work individually and their work collaboratively with artists. That's Eric and Ross. So thank you guys for being here. And then we also have April Banks with us tonight, who is an artist and has also worked with KDI, and they're going to share a little bit about a joint project, and April's going to also speak about her individual practice and projects, focusing on that design effort and how that happens in a really collaborative way in the field of public art. You know, it's not a studio practice. And so we're going to really take a deep dive look with this group about what it means to design your work in the context of community and other stakeholders, agencies, etc. So April Banks, this is my favorite part of the night when I get to introduce our speakers, because I am so proud of each and every one of them, and I'm so grateful that they have chosen to join us this evening and share a little bit about their practices, their approaches. It is truly an honor to be able to welcome you. April is an LA-based artist and creative strategist with deep roots in Virginia. Her hybrid practice is between image, space, experience. She's worked in from encaustics to public art. I would love to hear a description of encaustics at some point from you. I'm familiar with it, but not incredibly so. So that's one I'm excited to learn more about too. Maybe not tonight, but her work travels through, public art, time travel through archives and memories, using language of pattern, text, and glyphs to examine place and amplify lesser known stories. She has exhibited many places, US and internationally, Getty Museum, City of Santa Monica. She was selected for the 2023 Harpo Foundation Artist Grant and the Fellowship for Visual Artist Award in 2022, among many other things. We're so excited again to have April joining us tonight to share a little bit about her practice and specifically about her public art practice. I know you also have a studio practice, but thank you for joining us in that space tonight. We also have Ross Hansen from Senior Design Associate at Kunkui Design Initiative, KDI. He's based out of their Los Angeles office and is passionate about using design as a tool to catalyze social change. He leads their landscape and industrial designs for projects such as Adopt a Lot and the Jackie Robinson Park commemorative installation, Salazar Park installations, and LA County street carts. Prior to joining KDI, he was a landscape designer at Hood Design Studio and at Andrea Cochran Landscape Architect. He also worked as a design and fabrication manager at Lamasse. I did not know that. That's cool. And taught design and built courses at Woodbury University's Agency for Civic Engagement Center. Thank you, Ross, for joining us as well. And then finally, we have Eric Riley, Senior Planning Associate at Kunkui Design Initiative. Eric is an urban planner and filmmaker, proudly born and raised in the west side of Detroit. He's a senior planning associate at KDI in the Los Angeles office as well, where he works on several policy and planning projects aimed at transforming vacant or underused spaces in Black and Brown communities. Eric and April have worked closely together on a project that we're going to be speaking a little bit more about tonight. So I'm excited to have you here too. So thank you, Eric. Thank you, Ross. And thank you, April. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you all and we'll see your presentations. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Ali and Emily, for the introduction, and thanks for everybody for joining. As mentioned, my name is Ross Hansen. I'm a senior design associate at KDI. Next slide. And KDI is a nonprofit interdisciplinary design firm that seeks to know and group and work with communities intimately to as partners, so we can work to advance equity in the neighborhood, in the cities where it's been long been absent. Next slide. And KDI is made up of about 40 individuals located all over the world. We have offices in LA, we have offices in the Eastern Coachella Valley, Nairobi, and in Stockholm. And each of the 40 individuals, it's not uncommon that they ended up at KDI because they were asking themselves, they were sort of recognizing that there's not a pathway in the traditional design career to fulfill the whys. Next slide. And the further we got into our education and into our careers, the more we understood that our profession was responsible for creating the injustices that we were hoping to address. Next slide. And today we're a mission-driven firm committed to creating neighborhood equity, or what we now call a just public realm, or it's not where a design is not just a singular element or a singular research topic. It's sort of these all-inclusive things, and so that KDI works hard and goes out into the community to include, but also to create like resilient public spaces. Next slide, please. And how we do that is through a participatory design process. We often work in communities. We often have strong relationships with community stakeholders. We do a lot of surveying, identifying problems, and then we go after projects that are not necessarily intended. The creation of that project, an RFP or a project, is not necessarily set out to resolve that issue, but because of our deep understanding of the neighborhood, we sort of are connecting these dots, connecting the threads to the communities, but also some of the projects where there's more opportunity to address the issues. The next one is that this is images from some of the participatory design. This is some of the community surveys that we did in the Eastern Coachella Valley, specifically for the Oasis projects. And so we're surveying a lot of the local communities. We're having conversations with them, getting a lot of the local history, understanding what the parks or the public spaces can address. Amenities that are sort of lacking in the neighborhood, and then we get this next slide perhaps, and this is more images on just how we're getting the information. So it's storytelling, it's sort of collaging, it's anything, surveys, as I've been mentioning, to just to get information from the community on how we can begin to address it. Next slide. And these are some of the results that we do. So this is specifically those earlier slides were kind of like a standard that we do, but the next couple slides I'm going to be getting into like a specific project that we've been working with for the Torres Martinez tribe. So we're now just like phase one of this project was to exactly what I just said, where it was talking to the community, understanding the needs and wants, and now we're about to go into phase two with the designing of the park. So we, of the community that's participating, we've done a number of online surveys, and now we're starting to understand like who we spoke to. Did we speak to enough people? Like, what are still some of the holes that are doing? So we're constantly like moving back and forth between like advancing the design, advancing our sort of like understanding of the community and the community's wants. But we're also at the same time like, have we spoke to enough people? What are the holes that we need to still collect? Next slide, please. And we're engaging everyone. So it's not just sort of the elders or adults of the community. You know, we want to have everyone feel ownership or a part of the spaces or the designs that we do. So even like this is sometimes the most rewarding part when we're having these more like playful engagements where we're talking to everyone, and these are just children's drawings of the potential park. And so from the surveys, from the initial engagements, we begin to recognize themes that are appearing in all of the information that we're getting back. So for this particular park, we were asking or the community was telling us that the priority needs to be the cultural awareness, that we need to be having the culture be represented and not only in the amenities that are desirable, but they're also wanting like signs in the native language, images, cultural relevant artifacts. But then on the second one was just understanding that there's not a lot of like opportunities for health and wellness in the area. And so they wanted to prioritize sports. But they also had a strong desire. The third one would be like a strong desire for multi-generational bonding. So having the fitness element, having opportunities for both the youth and the elderly community to recreate together. And then the fourth one being safety. And the image to the side is just like identifying a lot of the common themes, a lot of the common amenities that people were requesting. Next slide. And these are just some of the workshops that we do. So these are pretty standard in all of KDI's projects. Going into the communities, nights and weekends, and having like intimate conversations with them about the work, about the project, and hearing the stories. Next slide. And these are specifically some of the collagings that we're doing. So previously we were doing the surveys, people were identifying the things that they wanted to see in the parks. And now we're sort of doing some spatial awareness, spatial studies for these, where we've done these sort of like bubble diagrams of the park, of the space. And so the community is starting to understand like the spatial relationships between the two things. There's different sizes of these bubbles. So they're starting to help us identify what sort of programming they want to prioritize, and where that should be located on the site, given some context. Next slide, please. Yeah, and these are just more images of some of the engagements that we've held in the past. And ultimately, like we came up with three options. So all of these three options have culture, they have the health and wellness, but there's also like ethnical, botanical. So these were sort of like three early options that prioritize those things. So each, like as mentioned, like all of these plans have elements of the culture, sports, and ethno-botanical aspect to them, but we wanted, after the engagements, we came back to the office and started laying out like some of the bubble diagrams and sort of using our understanding of the profession to sort of like massage what we were hearing. And so we eventually just took these options back to them to see which one they wanted to prioritize, and we came up with the next slide. And this is just sort of an adaptation of the early like cultural plus the health and wellness one. And so this has sort of been like the entire process of that participatory design that I mentioned earlier. And so that's a very rough and very quick process. And then so the last of the step would be into the building it. Oh, I guess here's like a few more renderings. So we do get out of the plan view and start creating renderings just to help like understand the materials that we're thinking about, that we're talking about. So we're all on the same page of the identity of the park too. And the next one would be another one where the sports would be the priority, having like a cultural art based element in the back, and the gathering space for the two generations. So the last thing of that thing would of the participatory design process is the implementation. And we haven't yet built this Torres Martinez Park. So these are images of the other parks that we've done in the Eastern Coachella Valley. This is the North Shore Park, where children are performing under a shade structure that we've that we've built with an architecture group. Next slide. Projects that we've done, Eric and I did in Los Angeles, where we had these series of events on a vacant lot to activate it and get ideas for potential uses in the future of that site. And then this is the Adopt a Lot program, where there's over 2,000 or so vacant lots in Los Angeles that are city owned. KDI has um, like found a way to have these become slightly more public, where we partner with the community organizations to adopt these lots for a year to 3 years. And we've designed like these kit of parts that can be implemented in a number of ways to meet the programming needs of the community. And this is another shot of the North Shore Park in the Eastern Coachella Valley.
Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, LA County, Dyson and Womack, and KDI for allowing me to be here or inviting me to be here. I am a Los Angeles-based artist, and I have both a social practice and public art as my focus, although I do have a studio practice as well. And the social practice and the public art are deeply linked. And so I'm going to do my best to focus on the kind of communicating the design process and not so much get into the social practice side of it, but just know that that was integral to these projects. So next slide. I guess my focus in the last few years has really been on erased narratives, forgotten stories, and the hidden histories in Los Angeles and California and elsewhere, and really working to creatively rethink how we can tell these stories. If they had been in the past, what would they be now in the future? So like looking at alternate realities based on an alternate history. Next slide. So there are, this is oversimplified, but kind of like these two buckets of public art, the community engaged public art and the commercial public art. I'm going to focus on the community engaged, which I feel like has a lot more responsibility for communicating, and it's less of a studio practice and more of a communal practice. So that's what I'm going to focus on. Next slide. So two projects that I'll talk about. One is community informed, meaning the community engagement process was required, not a proposal. So for the Belmar History and Art Project in Santa Monica, I was required, along with others that were shortlisted, to submit a community engagement process. And based on that proposal, I was selected. After the community engagement process, then the design would go forward. Versus Jackie Robinson Park, which was more of a co-design process. KDI and Clock Shop, another arts organization here in Los Angeles, invited me to be a part of the project, and with the community, we co-designed the work. So I'll start with the community informed design, Belmar History and Art. Next slide. So this was my very first public art project as an individual artist. I have worked on other teams as a designer. And so I wanted to share, instead of doing a full portfolio, I wanted to share one project in a little more depth, because I remember what it was like as an artist starting out and all the questions I had and just trying to figure out all of the different parts of it. So this project is to commemorate an erased community, a community that was displaced by eminent domain in Santa Monica, prominent beachfront property. If you know Santa Monica, Pico and 4th Street, about 2 blocks from the beach near Santa Monica High and the Civic Auditorium. This is like prime real estate. And so there was a new athletic field going in. The project historian, Dr. Allison Rose Jefferson, went to a meeting to insist that this history be told. And this was a California commission, this is a coastal commission, California Coastal Commission meeting. So they were the ones that are the main commissioners for this project, and then Santa Monica Cultural Affairs was the manager and the commissioner. So I just wanted to give you a little bit, this is kind of a unique set of circumstances. And so that's how this project began. It started in 2019 and then was interrupted by COVID. And when I say interrupted, the community engagement process was interrupted. So next slide. I'm going to show you some of what, first I'm going to show you the project as it was finished. So this is a permanent sculpture based on the type of housing called a shotgun house that was in that neighborhood. What came up in the community engagement sessions was this idea, like wanting to focus on the hopes and dreams of the Black families and other families of color. This wasn't just a Black neighborhood that came to this area with the hope of owning land and building businesses. And so there was wanting a desire to focus on a more positive aspect, a more hopeful aspect. And so I said, well, not rebuild, what has been erased. And so what you're looking at are 4 parts of this typical house in full architectural scale. If you go to the next slide, just quickly go through some of the details, the porch, the door, a representation of the house and the window as symbols of different aspects of communal living, of neighborhood life, of generations of families, including really thinking about shadow and light and how it moves across the site. Next slide. We included the bottom left, a time capsule community drawings, student artwork, letters from community members, all buried and to be unearthed in the year 2070, which is the year students chose. Next slide. Again, just kind of looking at some of the shadows that were cast, really thinking about the metaphor of movement and time by using the shadows of the patterns to do that. And then around the periphery of the park, we included graphic panels to tell the story of this community. That process was written and led by that project historian, Dr. Allison Rose Jefferson. And so next slide. Here's an example of some of those. And there are, I think, about 12 of them that tell different stories of the community members. Next slide. So I wanted to show you some of what can come up in the proposal process. Next slide. So again, as I said, I had to propose a community engagement process. But just before our presentations, we got an email and said, hey, could you also include some sketches of what you might be thinking about for the site? And so next slide. I just wanted to show a way of quickly, when you're in a situation like that and you have to come up with a solution, sometimes it can be really easy and quick to use an existing photograph and collage or layer on top of it. It can be very diagrammatic and get the point across. This was, very straightforward. And I just talked through some of the elements of it. Next slide. So I presented a few different options of, what was possible under the theme of movement. So that was really kind of the overarching idea. I was thinking about movement and migration. Next slide. And this idea of threshold. So really thinking about the entrance to the site and how to celebrate that. And so next slide. So then, now I have the proposal. I mean, I have the contract, And, you know, how do you go about communicating with everyone? You've got community members, you've got the people who commissioned you, you've got contractors who are building it or installing it. And so there's kind of a different set, a way of communicating with everyone and figuring out the best way and the most efficient way and clear way to do that is part of the process. Next slide. So in this case, this is not always the case. I had to choose where the art was going on the site. And so I spent a lot of time at the site. I feel it's really important to actually go to the place, spend time there, walk around, see it at different times of day, and then decided that this was the best place for the art to go at kind of at the entrance to the field. Next slide. And then I also needed to place where all of the graphic panels were going. So this is just a really simple diagram showing the panels all around the side of the park. Next slide. Then as I got into the design of it, first I started with really simple, flat illustration drawings in Illustrator. I've seen all kinds of different ways of communicating this, from collage to watercolor, hand drawing. I like to use vector-based drawings like Illustrator or Rhino because I can do it to scale. And then when it's time to go into final design and working with a fabricator, I already have a file that's to scale that we can talk about real materials and even pass off a model if necessary. Next slide. So, you know, how to communicate what the design actually is, because, you know, you can't rely on design language. It can be off-putting. It's also not very emotive all the time. And so just trying to find different ways to express your idea, what's important about it, whether it's color or shadow, how you experience it physically. And in this case, that was important to me because it's something that you walk through and it changes depending on your perspective. Next slide. Again, showing kind of the shadows that are being cast in the location that it's in. Next slide. Same here, getting some more detail, dimensions. This is starting to communicate. In this case, I had to get 3 different bids. So in order to do that, I had to have some real dimensions, so for materials, so that people could actually come back with a quote. Next slide. This, I really wanted to show what I was intending for this text. Like, what is this thing that we're looking at? This lines of text in red, that the shadow part of it was really important. And so I find that existing designs, samples of other artists' work is also often very effective in showing what you're intending if you can't illustrate it yourself. Next slide. Same here. I wanted to show some material options on the right, really starting to get more detailed of how I wanted to include like some of these early families, the old photographs that we were pulling from the archives. How could you start to include that in a permanent way? Because this is a permanent piece into the meadow. And so there are all of these amazing ways to use mesh patterns and metal to do that. And so this was to show that. Next slide. Just a side view here. Next slide. And then we get to the part where you're starting to, you know, go on site, see your work being made if you're not making it yourself. In this case, it required so many things because it's permanent, it's near the water, it needed to be certified welders, a very special paint system. And so that's way beyond my skill set. And so, you know, we hired a fabricator and a contractor to manage all of that. So I was going to site visits to, you know, look at joints and other things and ask for, could this be done this way? Could it be done this way? And so I think the fabrication visits, like really paying attention to the details and showing up is important part of the process, even after it's approved by the community and your commissioners, to continue to stay connected all the way through the process. Next slide. In this case, I also, because the site was under construction, was able to work with the landscape architects to really choose the plant palette from plants that they had already chosen, things that I thought would be complementary to the artwork. Next slide. And then this was somehow a part of my scope. This is a case where sometimes you can negotiate that maybe this, shouldn't be a part of my scope. So to design the graphic panels that were going around the periphery. So in the end, I did some studies that then were handed off to a graphic designer and to a writer. And so that's what these early mock-ups are, which were helpful for word count and for images for the project historian to get started. Next slide. Some studies of what those panels could look like, how they could be installed. Next slide. Same. Next slide. And then here's another version of just showing how something could land on the site. Again, it's just a line drawing, another way of trying to visualize the actual thing in the actual space. Next slide. And then this is Dr. Jefferson, my partner in the project. And this is the site where we also had project banners on the construction site to show, what was coming. And that, I think that's an exciting part for people to understand what's coming, and a way to include some of these great historical images from the archive. Next slide. And we also included some of those images for community members as postcards. Okay, I think that's the end of that, and passing it back to KDI to talk about our collaborative project.
Great. Thanks, April. And yeah, thanks to Dyson Womack and County Arts and Mellon for putting all this together. I just wanted to check to see how we are on time. I don't know if we can maybe put it in the chat, but just wanted to.
You're doing good. You're totally fine. Take
Okay.
your time. I think we can go for about 30 more minutes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so just right size this so everything can fit in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the preceding context for this project that we've been doing with April for the past 3-ish years. And then sort of how every step of the way of sort of getting to this final art piece that we're working on now, and then sort of all the communication levels that had to happen every step of the way. So you can go to the next slide. So for us, this project, and just my senior planning associate at KDI, and I've been working on this project basically from the beginning, and we were brought in principally to talk about Jackie Robinson Park as a public space. So like Ross mentioned, a lot of our projects are around sort of working with communities, doing these long-term deep dives to redesign public spaces in their image or in the ways that they want it. And we have been brought to Jackie Robinson Park principally, because of its history. So you can go to the next slide. So we have been brought on by the Los Angeles County Department of Parks and Recreation. We've been working with them on a number of these types of projects where we come to a community, we work with them over the course of like 4 to 6 months to apply for a statewide parks grant to expand the park or renovate the park. In the case of Jackie Robinson Park, we were coming to work with the community to expand it into that vacant lot. It's kind of weird to see, but directly next to it. And so we worked with the community over the course of about 4 months, and principally, like, we thought we were coming there to really focus on the park. You can go to the next slide. And I think we initially were pitched the project as talking about the park and it's like sort of really incredible history with Jackie Robinson and African-American community that exists. You can go to the next slide. But I think as we started to do the engagement, we really started to see that the community around it was going to be as much or probably even more important to how we were thinking about the park, the design, and then also what would inform like this future art project that we ended up doing with April. So I guess you can go to the next slide and I can give a little bit of background. So Sun Village is the community directly adjacent where the park sits. It's about an hour north of LA proper. Jackie Robinson Park was founded in the early 1960s by the African American community. Sun Village is a historically African American community. These were people who had moved to LA in the Great Migration and who had been redlined really out of central LA and went up to places like Palmdale, Lancaster, and Sun Village to start their own communities. Palmdale and Lancaster were also redline communities. So you had these African American communities that popped up sort of in these more rural spaces in the Antelope Valley. And out of that, you know, in the 40s, the 50s, when folks are arriving, you get a decade later this park that comes up. And this was also pitched to us as this was the first, one of the first Jackie Robinson parks in the country. And that was sort of the dominant narrative that we were being brought into this process with. You can go to the next slide. And so, like Ross mentioned, we started this project in the fall of 2020. It was still COVID, more or less. So that sort of like deep dive, like getting to know a place really well thing that we do was like a little compromise, but basically it just meant we did a lot of Zooms. We did a lot of talking with folks over the phone and figuring out, you know, what do folks want to see in this park? We did some pop-up like drive-through workshops. And this was all sort of like to get this grant, working with the county to do that whole process. But you can go to the next slide. We finished that process in about 4 months. So like basically January of 2021, we had this concept design for this park, for this new park expansion. We submitted it to the state, and this is a super competitive park process. So county from the beginning, county parks was always in our ear talking about, you know, we want to do something else. We want to have a quick win. We want to do something like that can happen faster than like this long-term park development. And it was also during this process of those meetings that we were having over Zoom and those conversations where every conversation we had about the park, no matter if it was about like the walking paths or Wi-Fi or lighting, the history of the park and the people and the women's club and the other folks that had made Sun Village and had made Jackie Robinson Park kept coming up. And I think we were seeing people who didn't even like live in California anymore coming to meetings, and people who were very emotional at every meeting. And you can go to the next slide. It started for us to make a more multi-layered history that was beyond sort of this park expansion project. So this history that started out about Jackie Robinson and like this great park and the first of its name became this more like multi-layered history. You can go to the next slide. And we started to find out a lot about the Sun Village's Women's Club. So there were a lot of ongoing initiatives. So parks had a historical context statement that had been written for the parks that talked about this history. The Sun Village Women's Club was a civic organization started by some of the women who were in Sun Village. They organized and did bake sales to raise money to buy the land that was officially donated to the county to create the park. And they became like the sort of like central locus of a lot of the history that we were hearing about. And so there was like this long ago history that we were hearing about. You can go to the next slide. And then there was also this sort of like legacy and this lineage of all these events that have been happening in the park for the like subsequent 50 years. So all the Juneteenth celebrations, which we just kept hearing, people would talk about it like it was like Coachella, like it was like the biggest thing to ever happen. Like it was, they would tell us these really incredible stories, and they had this like incredible archive. You can go to the next slide. You can kind of just probably flip through the next three, of all these like park programming that they did with like the drill team and boxing. You can go to the next slide. These like dance competitions they had, this like really historic Miss Sun Village pageant that they would put on every year. Next slide. This Black Desert Cowboys that they would always show up. And all this history was more or less contained in a hallway and some binders. You can go to the next slide. And so I think we were sort of in this weird phase where we were wrapping up in early 2021, this park expansion grant process. And then we also were left with this big sort of like, we didn't know what to do with this, which was like, we unearthed all this history. We brought all this stuff up in all these workshops and engagements. And now it's kind of just like floating. And this was also during a time, next slide, right around the time when folks, I think, were thinking about like, why are all these pictures just in like a, you know, a hallway that's also a storage closet? Next slide. This was also in the larger context of the Black Lives Matter movement and the larger like sort of racial reckoning that was going on in the country. Next slide. And folks beginning to think about, you know, who do we commemorate and why? Why isn't there a statue or a plaque to the people that we know are important to our community? And how do we start to change that? So you can go to the next slide. I really want to give county parks a lot of credit, because I think from the very beginning, we had an in-person meeting in like the fall of 2020. And from that very first meeting, KDI was there, Clock Shop was there, even though they weren't brought on in an official capacity. And they were already thinking about like, how do we start to formalize some of like this historic information that we're collecting that we know is going to come up in this engagement process. And so in the like spring of 2021, this loose project team started to come together. So County Parks, Clock Shop, Linnell George was brought on. She's a writer and an essayist. She also has a really great book about Octavia Butler that came out, I think, a year ago. And then Clock Shop also connected us with April. And it was sort of us starting to put together a team of figuring out, what is the story here? And I think the initial project sort of came out, you can go to the next slide, was this commemorative project. And so it sort of had a few stages. So in 2021, I think we were principally thinking about like, can we make a signage trail? And then we had a meeting with Parks and the Parks director, Norma Garcia, and she was really interested in doing a more permanent, more like sort of like longstanding piece of commemorative art that could go into the park. And so with her help and Office of Supervisor Captain Barger and LA County Regional Planning, we sort of like created this longer term commemorative art process and project that would result in sort of one major piece that April would be designing, and she'll talk about that later. An interpretive signage trail that KDI would be leading, and then Clock Shop would sort of be leading as like the main curator, bringing in some of these artists that I'll mention throughout the rest of the process. And then we brought on the Bass projects within the last year and a half to really help us lead like that sort of like fabrication, installation, managing all those elements for April. You can go to the next slide. And so for us, we're in this phase now where we've done a lot of meetings, and I'll talk about those, but it's sort of like in hindsight broken down into these three phases, where the first phase was really sort of like having some meetings to really define like what is existing in the park now, plaques, the time capsules, benches, engravings, figuring out what story is the park telling now. And then having another series of meetings, and I think April did the bulk of these, where it was really around like, what collective narrative do we want to tell? What story is missing and how do we tell that together? And then that last piece was just around like, what form does that take? And I think April also deserves all the credit for like the alchemical process of like taking everyone's opinions and everyone's pictures and everyone's like cousin that they know needs to be included in this history, and then figuring out a way to like, what's the container for all of that. So we did what we do all the time. You can go to the next slide, where we kicked off an engagement process where some of it was just based around like sort of like, come to the park, have some food, talk with us, and really trying to connect, I think, the artists on the team, so April, with like the community, and then also trying to collect ideas around like, we have this big personal informal archive that people have been keeping up. How do we want to, use that? How do we want to talk about that? And so we had a lot of meetings between 2021 and 2022. You can go to the next slide. That involved everything from like pop-ups at park events to like soul food dinners that we were able to have, and presentations that April was able to give throughout, which she'll talk a little bit more about. And then I think through every step of this process, and Clock Shop, I think, also deserves a lot of credit for this, was like also incorporating artists into the actual engagement. So you can go to the next slide. And for us, that was just like an easy way to kind of like make the communication about the design and the art that we were making more lively and more connected, but then also like a way for us to work with like local artists local to LA, but then sometimes also local artists to Sun Village, and give them opportunity to, lead workshops. So we worked with Stella at the Juneteenth of celebration in 2022. You can go to the next slide, to lead a portrait oral history session. She's done a similar thing with Clock Shop at their kite festivals. You go to the next slide. And that really gave us the opportunity to, one, get some like very beautiful portraits of these people that we have been talking to for a year, but also start to like formalize all the information and the ephemera that we were getting as far as like pictures and stories. And then we went to James, and he led a zine making workshop. You can go to the next slide, where we were able to do this sort of like taking all these archival elements and then just like putting them out on the table, and then having people put them together and remix them in ways that like maybe we hadn't thought about. You go to the next slide. And so that gave us like, a chance to really like highlight an artist like James, who's like from Sun Village, grew up there, has these like really deep connections with the park, and then allow him to sort of like lead people that he's known his whole life through, this archival material and rethinking it. Go to the next slide. And so yeah, that meant like creating these zines that were really fun to make, but then also gave us a sense of like what portions or what pieces of the story were really coming to the fore, as far as like how much do we focus on Jackie Robinson, how much do we focus on the women's club, who are other people that people think about when they think about the park. So you can't really tell right here, but there's a woman with a bridge of balloons over her in the bottom corner named Peg Lee, who also became this like really motivating force in every meeting, but also a central figure for everybody who we met with and talked about the park. And then another thing was working as a team, so Clock Shop, us, April, to figure out like how do we bring people into these spaces that are sort of dormant. You can go to the next slide. So it's also during that 2022 Juneteenth where we were having folks like having Pedley back there in the hat, like lead people through tours of the existing sort of like commemorative things that existed in the park, and giving people a real like sense of like this is the history that is currently sort of like hidden away in the hallway, and we are talking about like how do we bring that out to the park and make it public. And then we also did this in other ways. So Clock Shop worked on two things. They worked on this like this temporary exhibit where were just like really simple, let's just crack open all the binders and let people get the chance to go through them, but then also selecting like key moments and things from there for people to be highlighted as far as like on these bigger boards. And then we also made a publication that it contained those oral histories. It also contained an original illustration by James, and it was sort of like these little like acupuncture moments throughout the entire like design and planning process for us to kind of like let people know that like we're hearing what you're saying, we want to keep that momentum, and then that there's a way for us to, we're hearing how you want this stuff to be presented. And so for KDI, we were also in charge of creating the signage trail design. So what that meant was taking a lot of those archival images, working with this overall concept that April had come up with, which I think she'll talk about later, called the light of many suns, but this way of us talking about the many luminaries, not just Jackie Robinson, but definitely highlighting him, that existed in Sun Village and in Jackie Robinson Park, and then figuring out how do we cite that. So we ended up making 5 signs that kind of roughly tell these like big major buckets of themes that came up. So one about Jackie Robinson, one about the Women's Club, one about sort of the African American history of Sun Village and it becoming a self-made town, this sort of like saga of celebration that we were calling it, which is like all these Juneteenth celebrations, the Sun Village pageant, and then talking about like how is that history evolving today, talking about how the park and the community is evolving today. These signs were installed. You can go to the next slide. At this year's Juneteenth, it was a sort of like a trail that leads through the main sort of walkway of the park. And I think even from like the initial installation, we were seeing that immediate feedback of like one, folks, I don't think were like caught off guard or surprised. I think they kind of like have been with us along us with for the whole way. And then you can go to the next slide. For the people that were new to this history, so Sun Village now is like a majority Latino community. They were also seeing like, you know, this new side of the park and understanding a little bit more context about the space. And I think for us, it was about creating like this narrative that everyone could latch onto. So like everyone at any point throughout any of these engagements were invited in, but also figuring out fun ways to let people sort of like see this history and not make it stuffy and not make it just something that that makes the design harder to engage. I think going back to what April said. So I'll turn it over to April now, and she can talk about the other main piece of the art project, which is this very beautiful piece that April's been working on for the last couple of years.
Okay, we can just jump right in. I'll try to speed through these. Let's just go ahead to the next slide.
You're good, April. Take your time.
Okay, okay. So let's go to the next slide. So yes, there were many community presentations after this initial, you know, meeting with people and like, what are the stories? What's important for you to tell? And so in that first community presentation, it was trying to distill some of the subjects that were coming up and reporting back to people like this is what we heard. Is this what you mean? And then let's focus on, you know, what kind of stories come to the top. So next slide. The Women's Club, the origins of Sun Village, Jackie Robin's legacy, and then what the park means to the community now. Those were the main stories that were coming up. Next slide. And then ultimately, it really did kind of focus on the women's club because this park wouldn't be here without them. And so, you know, the piece in the end is called The Light of Many Suns because I think everyone did want to recognize everyone who has contributed. But this group of women, you know, they made it happen by, as Eric said, bake sales and like fish fries and other things to raise the money. They understood, you know, in this rural community, the need for kind of a town center, somewhere for kids to go after school, a place for celebration. And I think it's that need for public space, common space, that is what we really wanted to celebrate. Even though the community is changing, a lot of the younger generation has moved away, this history was important to commemorate in a permanent way. And so that's what this piece was about. Next slide. I think we can just kind of skip through this, but these are some of the images that I showed as we were talking about signage, like different ways on site that the signage of the stories could be told. And so again, just showing some existing work as a design reference. Next slide. So again, there was no set location. Sometimes for a project, you know, it's like, this is where the art goes. In this case, there were, after like spending time on the site and really looking at what's there, kind of distilled it down to these 4 locations. So in the community meeting, we project on the wall and say, all right, let's talk about this. Where do you want the art to go? Here are the pros and cons of this location versus this location. So that's what we did. These are the 4 key places. Next slide. And to help people really kind of understand, then we kind of walk through like something experiential. So you arrive in your car, you park your car. This is the main entrance to the park. What do you want to feel? What do you want to see here? Is this what we should celebrate? Should it be an archway? Should it be, you know, some big signage? Is this the place to basically spend the money and put the, you know, the focus of what this permanent piece is going to be? Next slide. So then we start looking at some examples of like what that might look like in the, you know, early stages. Next slide. Then this gym is facing kind of the main entrance. It's the building that's kind of on the outermost edge of the park, so it has a big presence. It's what you see first when you're driving in. And so we talked about like, is the gym the place for it? So we looked at the upper wall and the lower wall. Next slide. Then we talked about like what would be appropriate mediums for that surface, a mural, and then, you know, we kind of like in each case got into a little more specifics of like what kind of mural, and I will get to that later in a slide, but basically just saying that that would be something appropriate for this location. So next slide. Just giving more examples so that they can really start to visualize, you know, the impact that that could have, that location could have. Next slide. Whether it, you know, they talked a lot about the importance of the environment, the desert environment, how they wanted to celebrate it. This came up a lot in our community meetings, the night sky, the animals, the open land. And so, you know, do you want to really celebrate the land? Do you want it to be about the people? And so these are some examples to kind of help people talk through this. Next slide. There's also this well-used picnic pavilion. One, it's shady in a very hot place in the middle of the desert, but also there's a lot of groups that meet there. And so it could use some love. And so sometimes I think that art can do both the, you know, it could be functional. So it can be something that's aesthetic, but as well it can bring improvements to the spaces. And so at least the picnic pavilion as a place. Next slide. There's the inner walls, the outer walls. We talked about like how you can walk up to this one versus the gym, which is kind of out of reach. Like what's important to you to have a more a different kind of engagement with it. This is like you'd spend more time here because you're sitting next to it versus the gym, which is a big kind of more of a billboard moment. Next slide. Then I always like to show, again, a variety of materials. I try to only show materials that I know that can be afforded. And so when I'm looking for design references, I also try to find the prices for this. And this is actually a friend of mine. And so he does a wonderful transparent thing of listing the pricing on his website, and which I think is really important when you're new to public art to really understand what the materials cost. And so we talked about, this is a metal aluminum panel printed. This was a possibility. We were also worried about what could stand up in the desert to extreme heat, sand, extreme cold, and then also be graffiti resistant. They were very concerned about the longevity of it, making sure that it looks good. Next slide. We also talked about mosaics as something that is durable. Next slide. And then there's this open concrete deck, which used to be the place where there was boxing. And so this is really a clean, open plate, open for any kind of possibility. And so next slide, we talked about what if there was another place for seating and gathering with some landscaping on that space. Next slide. Here's some options, how that could also be both art and seating, a place for gathering that is also still very much an artistic piece. Next slide. So then at the next presentation, well, actually at the end of that one, people were very clear. They wanted the gym. They wanted it to be representative, so faces, but they also wanted it to be about the environment and the animals and all of the different clubs. So next slide. There was the challenge of all of the things that are in the wall, the openings, the windows, the pipes. And so really having to consider that when laying out or constructing what this mural was going to be. Next slide. We talked about looking at different mosaics and the level of complexity or fidelity you could get with faces and other objects, just so that we are all kind of on the same page about materials. Next slide. And then we got into some of the, different things, getting more specific about what the stories are, looking through the archives, what the images that they wanted to include, what was important to them. Next slide. Which included, they have all of these binders, which was such, it was gold to have so handy all of these resources. The former park director had kind of obsessively kept every photo, every newspaper clipping or program from past events. So we had a great source for reference images to include. And I met a group of ladies at the park to flip through them so they could tell me what the images were, and then we tagged them and I scanned them and did my best to incorporate as much of what they thought was important into the mural design. Next slide. So then, how do you begin? How do you start with all of these stories and kind of like what is the focal point? What are the key stories? What is the main story? And so this is the first kind of rough sketch to start to lay that out. Really focusing on the women's group, and then also Sun Village as a name, as a metaphor, like really focusing on this idea of the sun, the light of the sun, and including the stories that we know we wanted to include, but also leaving some spaces open so that in the next meeting we could discuss exactly what they wanted to include. There was a lot of talk about care, so that's where the hands came initially. And then next slide. This is kind of my own process of just like looking at things, laying them out, constructing the perspective and before starting to add color and detail. And then the next one is getting into a little more detail and color. And then ultimately realizing that the center weighted design wasn't going to work because of all of the openings in the wall. There's all these windows and light fixtures. So next slide, shifting the perspective off center also helped it feel a little more dynamic. This is me doing it all in Illustrator because it's going to a mosaic fabricator, and having that high resolution image is going to be easier for them to translate into mosaic. So again, this is what, in one meeting, going back to the community with some things roughly laid in and checking again and saying, these are the things we heard. These are the stories that we want to include. Are we on the right path? And so what came up in this was the churches. On the left, I took pictures of the actual churches, which were key foundational organizations there because they brought in services of water, power. They were the key institutions because it was so rural and undeveloped. And so that was something that the community really wanted to commemorate. There were so many churches. How do you do that? How do you, because we couldn't show all of them, like how do you represent it? So we talked through this in that meeting. Next slide. I also like to kind of put it in situ so that there's a understanding of like the scale of it. It really helped people understand. And that's when there was a lot of like, oh, wow, that's going to be big. So this is a 44-foot long wall, 11 feet tall. And so then there's more excitement again, because they understand the impact of it, of what that's going to mean to be able to see this as you enter the park from the street. Next slide. So, as in all projects, we thought we were pretty far along, and then we ran into this challenge. Next slide. Of this issue of the churches. So ultimately, the churches and all the buildings we represented in a more generic way. Because like I said, there were too many churches to specifically represent them all in a true way. And also, so much of the architecture there is this simple A-frame structure. So we thought we'd do it just by showing crosses, and then we were met with the need to remove the crosses. So the county said that we could not on public property have representation of religious iconography for various reasons. And so we had to go back to the drawing board and back to the community to say, how can we know these churches are important. This is not about promoting a particular religion. These churches had a purpose in the foundation of the community of Sun Village. And so how can we represent? So we went through a few different symbols, and ultimately they decided on prayer hands because they felt like it also represented this idea of care. And so this was the compromise that we made, removing the crosses. Next slide. And then at the end of it all, we went back to the community, printed it out large, not quite full scale, and showed it to them so that people could walk up to it close, show all the stories and how everything fit. We did that once at a community meeting, but this is also at the Juneteenth Festival. So a lot of people were able to come and see what is now in fabrication. Next slide. And you can keep going. So I just came back from the fabricator, seeing this being made. It's unbelievable, the amount of detail and I'm just blown away. This is, the first mural I've done, the first mosaic, and just seeing the translation and the whole communication process with the fabricator has been a big learning curve, but also really inspiring to just see what materials can do, and that this is a permanent solution. And it just feels like it really honors in a really beautiful way the stories that the community wanted to tell. And I think that is the end.
Amazing. Oh my goodness, guys, thank you so much for sharing for sharing those projects that you've worked on, but particularly the Jackie Robinson Park is incredible work. It is beautiful work. And I really appreciate the time walking us through that process of such an incredible process of navigating communities of different kinds of stakeholders and all of this to really build this design. And it's so cool to see it in production, April. I can't wait to see the finished piece, guys. It's beautiful. So we have a couple more minutes and we have some questions. So a couple of things, again, just to reiterate, if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A. And then Allie is going to read out some of our questions and help us to kind of navigate that. We are also going to invite back, well, I shouldn't say back, you haven't met them yet, but we're also going to invite Pat Gomez from LA County Arts and Culture. Hey, Pat, who can answer anything that might be more related to county questions. But we'll kick it off with, I think we have a couple of questions for April and KDI.
Sorry, I was muted. The first question is for April. When you have the pressures of so many stakeholders, how do you hold or retain your artistic vision?
That's a great question. That's a great question. What I have found, well, so it's very different than having a studio practice. Let's just go ahead and say that. Your responsibility is to make a piece for the community. Once you're done, like Charles Dixon said last night, once you walk away, the community owns it. So you have to really go into it with that, like yes, it is your design, but this is in a way, it's a gift to the community. And so your process is different. Yes, you bring your own artistic process, your way of thinking, your creative like problem solving to it. And most communities are looking for that because they don't know necessarily how. There are some stakeholders who are, very opinionated and they do have an idea of what they want. But for the most part, people are like, tell us what the possibilities are. Show us what can be done. Let's talk about, what we want. And then in that process, you really have to be willing to compromise, but also be willing to lead. And I think there is a lot of room to add, kind of your own personal style to what you're doing while also honoring what the community wants. It's a balancing act.
Mhm. And then we got a couple questions about the mosaic mural. Was the fabricated mosaic mural made by machine or by hand?
Yes, so the mosaics are made by hand. It's made by a company, Perdomo Mosaicos in Mexico. They've done a lot of the mosaics in the LA metro system, in New York, Chicago. So they're well versed with high use public spaces. And it's just really amazing to see how they work on it. So obviously the faces are done with much more detail. So the pieces are cut by hand in a more detailed way, where the big kind of field areas are much more just square tiles until it gets to a place where there's either text or something where the pieces have to be cut. So there's kind of two processes happening at the same time. And they actually split it across the studio, the ones that are focused on the faces and the more detail, and then the one that is like the really big open expanses of the landscape.
Hmm. And then there's a question for KDI. How is working with artists different from your approach to engaging with spaces traditionally?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah.
Sorry.
How is working with artists different from your approach to engaging with spaces traditionally?
Hmm. Um, I think, I mean, I don't, I, hmm. I mean, maybe this is that's a tough one. It's a good question. I think there's probably like, um, mm, yeah. I think that there's probably more agency given to the artist here. So like I would imagine like almost similar to what Eric was talking about in the Jackie province and more maybe, and Eric, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but I almost feel like we were sort of archivists or something like this, researchers kind of like helping the artists sort of find information, find the themes, find the topics, like potentially use some of our expertise in just like generating the stories. So I don't even know if it would be that much different from our landscape project. It's just like different scales, perhaps. Um, Eric, would you agree with that?
No, yeah, that was exactly what I would say. Yeah. I think we were like kind of like a bridge or like a yeah, just trying to like connect the artist to the community with like as few barriers as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then if I could add to that, because I have worked in a few different capacities where I'm contracted directly with the agency who's commissioning the project. And in this case, I'm a subcontractor through KDI, brought on by Clock Shop. So it's a different kind of team makeup. And I feel like every project is different that in that way. There's a lot of different configurations. And so I personally like having the teams because we can share the responsibility. It's a lot to manage all of it, as an artist alone. And so I like the partnerships. I like the work that a lot of organizations are doing around public space and park spaces in LA County. And so I was happy to learn about KDI and to partner with them and Clock Shop on this.
Um, this is a question for everyone. What have been some of the biggest struggles with incorporating community engagement in your design process?
I would say a lot of ideas. Um, and how do you synthesize it? How do you create a focal point? How do you navigate wishes that people have? So, we in the end, we ended up focusing only on people who are no longer alive, in the kind of focus sons, for many reasons. One, because then you get into people wanting to be on the wall, and then like how do you make a decision? Everybody wants to be on the wall, so that was kind of one of the criteria that we had. And then for representing like living, breathing entities, I guess, we focused on clubs or organizations. And so those are included, and that's not a specific person, but people can see themselves represented in that. And so that was one way of kind of navigating the desire to be commemorated, that most people have. It would be an honor to be up on the wall. And so I think that was one of the challenges that everyone like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think what April, sorry, did I cut you off, April? Were you finished?
No,
Yeah,
done.
okay. I think another thing that you mentioned was sort of like expectation or wishes to one thing that we've started implementing on some of the smaller scale projects during the community engagements, we'll start assigning be more transparent with the budget too. So we'll have um, we'll assign like a number to some sort of programming element. So like if you want a swing set, if you want like a swimming pool, that's great, but you have like a specific bucket of money, and that each programming thing that you put on, has to add up to this thing. So you know, we try to just find like creative ways to not like stifle like creativity or it's just like, yeah, I mean, we can't get we can't um
Not a
potentially do
endless bucket.
everything. So
Yeah, you
yeah,
Yeah,
can't
yeah,
please
yeah.
everybody. I mean,
yeah.
that made me think about something as well that I'm gonna interject my own question for a quick second. But how do you deal with disappointment? I feel like that must come up sometimes, and I'm curious um about that part of it too, about like, because you guys do so much work to bring community stakeholders, not just community, but actually the project stakeholders along with you on this process. But I'm sure there's points where there's disappointment about maybe my idea didn't get in there or something like that. And I think that speaks to like ultimately being like the artistic integrity or the design integrity of what you're trying to do. I'm just curious if that's played a role in some of this.
Yeah, I can say for for one project, one way we dealt with not being able to include everything was to do continued programming.
Hmm.
So the project is done now, but now we can do these programs, you know, a publication, tours, classes, other things that can address the things that we couldn't include as a part of the project can now. And then in a way, I think that's better. It keeps it like a living, breathing thing that is used and interacted with by different groups of people.
I actually also want to jump in real quick. You know, with the county, we have different kinds of projects. Sometime there's a project that is very specific, maybe to a history that is involved in that community, and that is really the overriding concern. And those types of projects, the more that they have that sort of very specific purpose in a way of having the art. It's an artwork. It always first and foremost has to be an artwork. We want the artist voice there. We want it to be the artist's vision. We want the artist hand. Like that is of such importance to us. That is a really very um, uh, foundational thing in our artwork. We have what we consider an art collection, but it is a public art collection, as they're saying. But in those cases, that sort of uh, community connection where there are, you know, maybe more of an invitation for more specific kinds of elements or memories to come in, there's more of an opportunity for that. There are other pieces that maybe don't have that specific purpose as a piece. Maybe the piece is there has an aesthetic purpose for enlivening a space. And or it may be a situation like maybe it's in a health center where it needs to contribute to an overall environment of calm, or you know, celebration in another kind of space. So there's different kinds of spaces, and the artwork is sort of working differently depending on those types of spaces. So when you're thinking as an artist of applying for a particular opportunity, that would be something to think about, you know, look, because we'll always list, you know, what is the goal of the work? Why are we doing this work there? What are the themes that we're trying to say? And so it would be important for you as an artist to see if that's going to resonate with you in applying in the first place. So we always do want to see some community engagement, but the type of engagement can change depending upon the type of work it is, depending on the artist, and depending on the purpose of the work. Sometimes it's about this idea of generating history and information, and other times it's really community engagement, which is allowing a connection for the community to embrace that artwork as an artwork.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
oh, sorry, Allie.
Cool. No, it's okay. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I saw a question that actually was directed towards you. It's actually a nice follow-up of this. So I was just gonna, as while we've already got you, add that in, which was about whether or not with the commissions that the county puts out, if it's really important that both the materials and the artists, and maybe even the fabrication happen in California, is that a priority for the county or not?
Well, it's gonna depend. In our call, we always will list the eligibility in terms of if there's a geographic requirement for an artist to apply. A lot of our calls are looking for either Southern California, sometimes it's Los Angeles County. It kind of depends on what's going on with that work. I mean, with the sort of the goals that I talked about. We have a call out that we made national because it was a site that is honoring a particular individual, and we thought that individual, an artist, and we thought that artist students may be anywhere in the country, so we opened it up nationally to allow that participation. So it's going to depend. In terms of the materials, we generally will go in saying this is the location where it's going to be, and we leave it up to the artist, but we are looking for permanent materials. Our collection is a permanent collection, and all the works need to be fabricated in materials that would last 25 years. As to the specific material, it's really going to be how that artist's vision can translate best.
Thanks.
Could I just go back to that previous question of like, I don't know if it was around disappointment. Maybe there's a better
Yeah.
word to use for that, but like, I think that's what's so important about just like constantly checking in with the community too, and just sort of like being as transparent on all the details of design before it's implemented too. So I think that's what I was appreciating most about like April's presentation is that, you know, there was like all these diagrams. You know, I know that we're trying to collage things, we're trying to put models out in front of the community. So and trying to get it off of just like paper, because often that's kind of abstract, you know, and you know, April putting the mosaic on top of the actual space, trying to get it at like real one-to-one scale, in a cheap and like a inexpensive and clear way. I think that's really smart, and I think that it's very helpful for the community to see it and sort of like address some of their concerns, some of their issues before it's implemented, and try to like come up with the compromise then before
Can I
it's done.
say one other thing just on the disappointment? I feel like there's so much managed disappointment, but I also think I think that's also come up, or I guess like it's like a underneath point that probably hasn't been said more explicitly, but like I think for us, like either in design and in art processes, like you're doing the community engagement to build trust with the community, so that like we've had processes where like in the last meeting and we're like, this is the final concept design, this is the final thing, and there's someone that is jumping on board just then, and they're like, you know, I thought we were getting a bronze statue of Jackie Robinson. And you are building that trust of the community, not just for nothing. Though when those moments happen, you have people in the community there to be like, no, I'm sorry, we've been working on this for a long time. We've done these programs, we've done the publication. And you have people that are like, you know, sort of your community of advocates for like either like the larger park design or like this individual art piece. And that's just really helpful to have too.
That takes us to our next question. April, how did you learn about doing Illustrator? Your illustrations are so powerful. Do you see a reflection of your art practice and how you lay out even on a site plan?
So, how to answer that? Well, I'll start by saying that I guess I would be considered fairly new to public art. This is my fourth commission, with the fifth one just kind of floating in limbo, and since 2019. So every project has been so different, and I'm learning about materials and processes for every project. So I'm relying on things that I know, like Illustrator, Photoshop, to communicate with the fabricator. And that's why I was saying, you know, there's a lot of ways to do it. And I've seen other people who do hand drawings, who do watercolors, who do collage. There's a lot of ways to communicate the design. But I find that working in a vector-based program like Illustrator, you can work to true scale. You can also scale it up. And in this case, I had to send a file that needed to be printed full scale. So that's 44 feet long. And I saw in their shop the printer. And so working like that just worked better for everyone. I happen to know, you know, Illustrator and Photoshop, so I didn't have to learn it in order to do this. I'm also not a muralist, but this is what I was hoping the community would go towards something more dimensional, maybe furniture, maybe, you know, something more architectural, but they were certain. They were like, no, we want a mural. And so Mosaic was the way to go. The beautiful thing about Mosaic is that you just need the artwork, and Mosaic can work from painting. There's a lot of different ways that the mosaic can be created. So I would just say, you know, don't get hung up on how you create the image.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd like to second that. I formerly was with Metro, where we did a number of mosaics and also a number of works that were translated onto metal. And those works, basically, the artist provided the digital files. Well, they could come from something like Illustrator, but also we had artists that were photographers or artists that were muralists themselves. And what they would do is the photographers, they could, you know, digitize that in a very, very high resolution way. But the artists that were, you know, painters or collage or anything of that nature, they would create the work to scale, maybe 1/4 size to scale, something that's substantial, but not the full size. But then they would hire a photographer to document it in very high resolution digital photography. And then that is what is provided to the fabricator. So again, as April was saying, there's different ways to translate or to provide that image to that type of a fabricator. So you don't feel you need to change how you work. There is a way to document it in the way that it's going to be workable.
That's great. There's a follow-up question that's similar to that, that was about more like traditionally 2D trained artists. What kind of programs should they consider learning for 3D fabricated sculptures beyond sketches? Blender, Maya, SketchUp, are there other things that you think might be good for them to learn if they're trying to move from 2D to 3D?
Yeah, I mean, there's all the digital tools. I use Rhino. There's also, yeah, Blender, SketchUp. There's also a lot of scanning technology now. So you could even make something in clay and have it scanned 3-dimensionally. And then now you have a 3D model that can be scaled up, that can be replicated for, you know, making a mold. There's a lot of digital tools. And also, you don't always have to do all of that yourself. That can be part of your process and your team, to hire someone that can help you do those things. Like, it's a lot to take on to try to figure out how to learn all of these tools. And the community engagement and like, I really learned, ask for help when you need it, so that the project can have the best outcome.
Allie, I think there's a question about the park, and I was just going to bring KDI back into that one. About at the beginning, you talked about the park expansion, the Jackie Robinson Park, and there was just a question about whether the gym addition was part of that.
No, the gym was built on the current footprint of the park, and I think maybe I skipped over that part fast. We didn't get the grant to expand the park. which is why the importance of this art process became even more important. But yeah, the gym was added in 2002. That was like the last new addition that was added to the park, and the rest of it was more or less the same from like 1964.
Got it. How long was the community engagement process for that project for both of you? A question to both of you.
So it's tricky. I know, yeah, I don't know when like that first meeting happened, but I know like spring of 2021 was when, yeah, it's a little complicated in that KDI was first brought in with Clock Shop as a sub to MIG for a smaller version of the project, and then KDI was brought on as the prime. Then we brought on Clock Shop in April. I think that must have been, yeah, like late 2021, early 2022, maybe.
Yeah, I think I started in early 2022 officially.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the community engagement process really has been going on through like June of this year, because
Yeah.
when they have their Juneteenth festival, we always go and support or speak or help with their temporary display. So yeah, and the unveiling for that is in the fall. So I mean, I kind of see it as it's ongoing.
Um, Someone asked about the mosaic. How did you find someone to install the mosaic tiles that were created in Mexico?
So this is where I said I need help and asked for a project manager. And so that's where Labas Projects came in to manage the fabrication and installation part of it. And so we did a search. There's tile installers. There's also a list of resources that the county and other arts organizations offer. So you don't always have to figure out all of these things yourself there. Yeah, so this installer was actually recommended by the mosaic maker, the mosaic fabricator, as someone who's installed past work. So we felt confident because they know how that particular mosaic fabricator works, and they've done other projects in the Los Angeles area. And so that's how we decided to work with that installer.
Mm. Um, there was a question about sustainability. How can sustainability considerations be effectively communicated in design presentations?
Hmm. Are we talking about sustainability of materials?
Yeah, the materials, the life of the artwork,
Mhm.
how do you communicate that? Because I feel like it is a crucial element in most public art commissions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would want a clarification. Is that durability or sustainability? Like specifically what that
I think
means.
they're referring to both durability and then like environmental impact. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, research and like what's possible, what materials are possible for that budget and for that site, if that's not already specified, for some reason for your contract.
Mm.
Sometimes it is like, if it's an airport commission, it might just be that it's a glazing or that it's tile. Like sometimes it is already specified. But if you have a choice, I think you can do the research on the longevity of materials. There's a couple of books, of course, I don't remember the titles right now, that talk about public art and really like all the things that you should consider, from like placement next to certain kinds of soil or sprinklers or, things like that that you can consider. And there's definitely people who are talking about materials and things that are toxic or sustainable. I think there's also some restrictions on certain kinds of paints in California, at least on, yeah, that came up for me in one of my projects. So, yeah, I think it's just research and then looking at what those specifications are for those particular materials.
Also, when artists are providing us with their proposals, at a certain point, we're going to be looking for them to provide information about their materials. And a lot of times it's a spec sheet that comes from the fabricator, or, if it's a certain kind of a newer kind of a glass, maybe there's a warranty that comes with that. So we're going to want that warranty information. Or, if it's certain kinds of metals and so forth, it's, those are tried and true. That's going to be less of a concern. Obviously, there's not going to be a big concern about a mosaic that's made out of stone degrading. I mean, it's stone, it's going to be there forever. That's not so much of a concern. But if you're using, let's say, a newer metal or something that's not sort of one of, the very tried and true for hundreds of years metals or materials, then we're going to be more interested in seeing information from that fabricator about those materials, about the maintenance of those materials, and then about any warranties that might be involved.
We had a question, it's funny, we're talking about materials a lot, but we did have a question that I think came up for both KDI and April, that with your permanent pieces, the parks you've done, etc., have you seen instances where vandalism and things like that have affected the works, and how have you managed that when they're supposed to last for more perpetuity?
Yes, I've had a permanent piece and a temporary piece vandalized. And so we always keep the specs, and in the case of the permanent piece, it is owned by the city, so they have funds, the city of Santa Monica, so they have funds to take care of the piece. There's also a schedule to wash it, to maintain the grounds around it. So when it becomes a part of the collection, there is a maintenance process for it. So in that case, they had to bring the contractor back to do paint repair on site. The same for the temporary piece. They actually use an insurance policy, but since it was a temporary piece, to have the piece repaired.
ADI, I'm curious, do you feel like you experience a lot of that, or do you feel like the processes that you utilize with bringing in stakeholders helps to kind of mitigate some of that in the spaces you've built, or not?
Yeah, I think like some of the ownership of and the process and the stakeholders, I do think that, as far as I know, I feel like we've had really good luck with that. Some of the issues that we've run into is more like weather based, so it's like flooding, um, like UV, um, kind of like alterations of the color. But I think April's right. It's like it's a lot of just about being due diligent about the maintenance programming, um, the maintenance schedule afterwards. Yeah, keep the specs. Um, you know, I also think it's just like something to consider when you're designing, um, a public piece, is that it's probably not going to be pristine always, and like how can this sort of aging, actually make it a more interesting and successful piece.
Ali, I think we have time for one last question if you want to pick that. I know we have a couple more and we'll try to get to them if we can in responses offline, but let's see if we can fit in one last question tonight.
Yeah. This one is about tailoring presentations. How can artists make tailor their presentations to resonate with different audiences, such as community members versus project collaborators?
Great last question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean it's constantly just changing the message, so like community to communication with the county, you know, there's just like different things that you want to know. So there's a ton of work that goes into these presentations. There's a ton of work of like changing the drawings, updating it. How can you do it? I think it's just like setting up a storyboard before, kind of like understanding the goal of the meeting, um, and the message you want to convey, and you know, how can you know, Eric, I think touched on it earlier too about like the gaining the trust of the community. So, um, I think it's just like, I don't know. I think I'm just rambling now, but like, you know,
No, but
just
actually,
having, um, just being sure that you have the right content in to the client. So trying not to, you know, have like confusing drawings in there, to simplify things as much as possible. Um,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think
I don't
like
know.
all that makes, yeah, I think everything you said, Ross, and then just also like understanding. One, I think every presentation is like a chance for you to like tell a story about the project, and then just figuring out how you're going to pitch that, and then also understanding like the audience. Like the meeting with like the maintenance people and stuff will probably be like a tougher meeting where they're asking you very specific questions about like the metal and the bolts and like having that type of stuff ready, and then also, you know, I think about, Ross and I worked with Pat, on the Salazar Park project, and Paul Botello, who's a muralist, gave this really incredible presentation about his like history with murals, and it was just like this very like cozy like story that he was telling about his relationship with the community and all the murals that he's done, and then what he wants to do with this mural. So I think it's all about understanding the audience and then how you kind of want to tell the story.
Yeah, I would say um, definitely knowing your audience, and when you're talking to community, sometimes it's important to listen as much as you're talking, and then also like really talk about experience and try to stay away from design jargon, art terms, those kind of things. Make it as experiential as possible, story based, walk people through what it feels like, what they could expect, what they might experience. Because ultimately people also want to be able to tell a story about, you know, the art that's in their community. So empowering them to have a understanding and to have ownership, and trusting that their intuition is correct. And so that's very different, yes, than communicating a very specific, this is exactly, you know, like if you've got to work with an engineer, if you've got to have a piece that's needs to be engineered, that's a very different kind of conversation. It needs to be much more precise. There's a different kind of language that you use. So you are kind of code switching depending on who the audience is.
thank you guys so much. I really, Ross, I really loved when you said focus on the goal of the meeting. I think it's sometimes super hard for artists to, and all of us, to get away from what we think we're trying to communicate. And so sometimes shifting that perspective and putting yourself into the feet of the person you're communicating to and saying, what are they trying to get from this, can help us get out of our own heads about what we think we should be trying to communicate. I thought that was a really nice share. Actually, that question was a perfect ending question. And I just want to thank you guys again for being so open and so direct and so transparent with your process and your thoughts and your approach. It is, we've used this a lot, but it is truly a gift. And thank you, Pat, as well, for joining us in these questions and providing some of that critical context about how the county operates. Because as we've been exploring over these sessions, every context is different. Every commissioning agency operates differently, and there's just so many facets to this field. And so thank you, April. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Eric, for sharing the particularities of the spaces you operate in and the works that you have done. I'm familiar with some of the pieces, but not in that level of detail. And it was truly I learned a lot in myself in hearing how you presented that. So thank you. And I just, before we go to our closing remarks, is there anything else, April, Ross, Eric, that you just want to say or share tonight? Just give you a last sentence or two if you like, but we can also go to the closing.
Yeah, I think I would just say, if you're new and you're starting out, don't be afraid to ask questions, find help, ask for help, ask for mentorship. There's no way you could possibly know everything. I'm still learning everything even after, 5 projects. But it's exciting, it's rewarding, it's a lot of work, but I'm just super excited that there's programs like this. I think it just really opens doors in ways that, I've wanted to do public art my whole career, and it just took a really long time to find just the right door opening. But I feel like this is going to give opportunity to a lot of people to be able to enter the field. So thank you for creating this opportunity.
Yeah, I'd also like to say thanks for creating the opportunity, but also for the participants in here, who good for you, like this, like it is important to just like continue to understand how to get projects, how to design projects, how to communicate, and it's so important to listen to various professionals, practitioners, and get experience, so good for you.
Like, that's too good of a note. We can leave on that.
Pat, anything else from your perspective for tonight?
No, I just want to encourage people to keep coming to all of these because they all have their separate little gems. And I think altogether that it's a really good sort of course and the goal of this program is to welcome more people in, to break down barriers, and to demystify it, public art.
Amazing. Allie, thank you so much as always for helping keep us navigating through questions and time. I very much appreciate it. Thank you again to our panelists. As I always say at the end of these sessions, this is an iterative process. We will be doing another set of workshops next summer. And so if you look at this lineup and there's things that you're like, man, I'd really love to see a workshop about this, or I don't know if they're going to touch on this topic, please email us, let us know where we're, the things that you may not see in this version, because we will be able to do it again. And we want to make sure that we're meeting the needs of this community, of our fellow LA County artists. And then last of all, again, just a plug, and I realized we have this wrong on this slide. I'm so sorry. August 21st is a Wednesday, not a Thursday. So our next session with the folks is next Wednesday. I know we've talked about that a lot, but it's going to be a great session. We have representatives from so many different agencies across Southern California that commission artists coming to show how you can be involved, how you can find out about their calls, how you can get on their pre-qualification lists, how you can learn more about the opportunities that they have for artists. And then obviously, as Pat said, the rest of this course continues on from there. If you missed some of the starting, 2 of our sessions are repeat sessions. That is the applying to public art open calls and the preparing a public art portfolio. So if you miss those and you don't want to wait till they're available online, totally come back. We'll be doing those sessions again. They're really the kind of primer foundational level sessions. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night. Thank you again to our co-presenters, our tonight, and to Pat as well for fielding questions. So we'll leave it there. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye. Good night,
Bye.
everyone.